All right, folks, let me tell you, the BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, are really stirring the pot at the United Nations. And it's about time. They're tired, just like we are, of how these Western nations have a stranglehold on all the major international organizations. It's all about the US, the UK, and their buddies calling the shots, while the interests and opinions of emerging nations get the cold shoulder. So what's happening now? These BRICS nations are banging the drum for a massive shakeup at the UN. They're saying, enough is enough. At their recent summit, there was this big push for a more democratic UN structure. And you know what? They've got a point. Why should the same few countries always have the veto power? It's like the Security Council is some kind of exclusive club for the old guard. The BRICS are demanding a reevaluation here. They want in, and they want it to be fair. They're talking about a total overhaul to make the system actually represent the whole world, not just the West. And let's talk about hypocrisy. Oh, you're gonna love this. When it comes to human rights, the UN's got a double standard that's as clear as day. China and Russia get hammered for every little thing, but what about the issues right in the backyard of these Western nations? Hardly a peep. Take the refugee crisis. Europe rolls out the red carpet for Ukrainians, which is great, but what about the folks from Syria, Afghanistan, or Somalia? They face a much tougher ride. And then there's Israel and Palestine. Talk about a one-sided show. Israel gets a pass way too often, while Hamas gets all the blame. It's not right, folks. And don't get me started on influence. The BRICS are growing fast, their economies are booming, but do you think the old-timers at the UN, the World Bank, or the IMF pay attention? Nope. It's still a club run by the Americans and the Europeans. The leadership, the policies, it's all set up to keep them on top. Economically, too, it's the same old tune. These Western-led institutions love to attach strings to their aid, strings that just happen to pull these countries towards policies that benefit the West. Austerity, fiscal discipline, code words for keeping these nations down while pretending to help. So yeah, the BRICS and a bunch of other nations from the global South are making their voices heard. They're sick of the status quo that serves just a handful, and they're fighting for a seat at the table. And why not? It's about time things changed, about time everyone got a fair shake at this global governance thing. Oh boy, let me tell you, these geopolitical rivalries, they're just heating up like never before, especially with Russia and China right in the middle of it all. Now you see, the West, they've been throwing sanctions and all kinds of political heat at these BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, trying to clip their wings on the global stage. It's clear as day, folks. They don't want these nations having any say in how things run, and that really rubs them the wrong way. Take China, for example. The West has been all over them about everything from Xinjiang to Hong Kong, and don't get me started on the South China Sea. The US and the EU, they've been slapping sanctions left and right, thinking they can keep China from becoming the powerhouse it's destined to be. But let me tell you, these actions, they're just making tensions soar and painting the West as the big bad wolf in this global tale. And then there's these alliances, like the Quad with the US, India, Japan, and Australia, and AUKUS, linking Australia, the UK, and the US. You think these are friendly get-togethers? No way. They're strategic moves, plain and simple, aimed at keeping China and Russia in check. BRICS sees this as a straight-up containment strategy, and it's not sitting well with them. They feel sidelined, folks, pushed out by these big Western clubs that think they run the world. Let's not forget the big money game at the International Monetary Fund, IMF. Now, the voting power there? It's all about the West. The US holds the biggest stick, but here's the kicker. China, with its economy over $14 trillion strong, it's the world's second largest, and what do they get? A sliver of the vote. Doesn't add up, right? It's like showing up to a potluck with the biggest dish and being told you can only have a tiny taste. BRICS has been hollering for a fair shake, but the IMF? It's still playing by the old rulebook. And this pandemic, COVID-19, it blew the lid off the unfairness in global health. While rich countries were hoarding vaccines like squirrels with nuts, BRICS was out there calling foul on the World Health Organization and others, saying the response was tipped way too much towards the wealthy. It's a world where the rich get richer and the sick get sicker unless they can pay up. Now, about trade, BRICS isn't pulling punches here either. They're tired of how the US and Europe rig the game with their agricultural subsidies, messing up market prices, and sticking it to the small-time farmers in developing countries. It's a rigged deck, my friends, and BRICS is calling for a reshuffle. Absolutely. Let's make this history of the UN a little bit clearer and give it the flair it needs. So here's the deal. The United Nations, folks, that big organization aimed at keeping the peace and advancing freedom, supposedly, was set up in 1945, right after the world was practically demolished by World War II. The whole idea was to prevent countries from knocking heads again, pushing for peace, human rights, and all that good stuff about economic development. Now, let's talk about how this all started. On October 24, 1945, 51 countries, all worn out from the war and eager for peace, decided to team up. They gathered in San Francisco at what they called the United Nations Conference on International Organization, and that's where they signed this very ambitious UN Charter. This wasn't just another meet and greet, it was the foundation of what they hoped would be a new world order, stepping up from the ashes of the League of Nations, which, let's be honest, totally dropped the ball on stopping World War II. Franklin D. Roosevelt, he was the guy who first tossed around the term United Nations to describe the Allies fighting together during the war. The setup? Pretty straightforward. They put together these 6 big parts of the UN. The General Assembly, where everyone gets to talk. The Security Council, that's the powerhouse with the big 5. Yeah, the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Russia, and China, plus 10 other members who switch up now and then, keeping an eye on peace and security. Now moving to the post-Cold War era, from 1990 to 2000, when the Berlin Wall came down and everyone thought, hey, maybe we can all get along? The UN was all over the place, jumping into hotspots like the Balkans, Rwanda, and Somalia with their peacekeeping troops. But let me tell you, it wasn't all smooth sailing. The Rwandan genocide? A real tragedy, and it showed some serious cracks in the UN's shield. They took a hard look at themselves after dropping the ball there. During the same decade, they were big on this thing called sustainable development, talking a lot about how to keep the planet green and clean. The Earth Summit in Rio, back in '92, that was a milestone, kicking off things like the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Convention on Biological Diversity. Oh, folks, let me tell you something. The United Nations, it's got problems, big problems. We're looking at an organization that's supposed to bring peace and prosperity, right? But many are saying it's outdated, stuck in the past, doesn't reflect today's world, not at all. So what are we going to do? We're talking big changes, massive changes. Now there's this idea floating around. Let's shake things up with a new organization. Not just any new club, but one that really shows who's who in the 21st century. Imagine this. We expand the Security Council, bring in the big players like India, Brazil, and South Africa. These countries are not just sitting around. They're major league with serious influence and economic muscles to flex. We need a council that's more like the World Series, not some little league game, right? And let's not forget our regional powerhouses, organizations like the African Union, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, and the European Union. These groups understand their backyards better than anyone else. So why not boost them up? Let them handle the local stuff, make some real decisions, while they work with a central global organization on the big-ticket international issues. It's about making things efficient, effective, and yes, fair. But here's a kicker, a real game changer, the Democratic Nations. Now that's a name, right? It's a proposal for a brand new entity with a setup that's like the US Congress, a bicameral legislative system. That means 2 houses, folks, one that represents the governments and another that's all about the people, directly elected reps who actually answer to the citizens, not some bureaucrats. This isn't just pie in the sky. The European Parliament, can you believe it, has been pushing for something like this, a UN Parliamentary Assembly. They say it'll make the UN more democratic, more accountable. People all over the world, they're supporting this. There was this poll, big numbers, showing 60% of folks in 15 countries love the idea of a world parliament, a place where their voice isn't just heard, but actually counts. Now, setting this up, sure, it's going to be tough. You've got to get all these countries on board, and some with all that veto power might not want to play ball. But starting small, making it advisory at first, could just be the way to show its worth without stepping on too many toes. So we're talking big reforms, real changes that reflect our world today. The UN's done some good. Nobody's denying that. Remember the Millennium Goals, the Sustainable Development Goals? Good stuff, but it's time for the next step. Let's bring our global governance into the 21st century. Make it something we can all be proud of. Let's make it great, folks. Thank you for watching. We sincerely appreciate you joining us today.